After studying this module, you shall be able to identify the factors affecting inflation, to learn about the costs of inflation, and understand the short-run trade-off between inflation and unemployment.
Inflation and unemployment are two very important macroeconomic problems that bother economists, policymakers, and the public at large across all countries. The problem becomes more precarious if it involves a trade-off between the two. In other words, if the policymaker is trying to reduce inflation, unemployment increases and vice versa. In this module, we learn about the empirical evidence of such a trade-off. But first, we look at the causes and costs of inflation. Let us start our discussion with what is inflation. Inflation is defined to be a condition of persistent rise in general level of prices. The inflation rate measures the rate of increase in the general price level. Generally, this is positive, indicating prices are rising. Sometimes we may observe a negative inflation rate, which signifies a situation of deflation or falling prices. Inflation does not, however, imply that prices of all goods and services are rising. Since numerous goods and services are produced in the economy, price of some goods and services may be rising, whereas prices of others may be falling. An inflationary situation indicates that the general trend of prices is upwards, as measured by some aggregate price index, such as wholesale price index or consumer price index in India. The question therefore is, what are the causes of inflation? There are two primary causes of inflation. We define them as A. The demand pull factors, B. The cost push factors. We can use the aggregate demand and aggregate supply framework, which we have learnt earlier, to explain these factors.
As shown in figure 1, this can happen if government spending is increased or private spending on consumption and investment increases. In figure 1 below, assuming that the aggregate supply SAS has a positive slope, the price level would increase from P0 to P1 and the output would increase from Y0 to Y1. To explain inflation, a one-time increase in the price level is not enough. The increase in the price level must be sustained from one period to the next. This means that the aggregate demand, AD, must continue to shift upwards so that price level increases from P1 to P2. For example, if the government runs a budget deficit for several years, it will fuel a persistent price rise and result in inflation. However, the shape of the AS will determine the extent of inflation. A horizontal AS curve will have a zero effect on the price level, whereas a vertical AS will have the maximum impact on price level. and therefore will be highly inflationary as there is lack of excess capacity in the economy. Now we look at cost push inflation. This type of inflation arises due to shift in aggregate supply curve, AS curve. Suppose price of important raw materials such as oil or steel increases in the economy. This can leave an impact on the price of goods and services across the board, leading to an increase in the average price level. Once again, the increase has to be sustained over time to be termed as inflationary. In figure 2, due to the adverse shock, AS continuously shifts upwards as any given level of output is now produced at a higher price. The price level increases from P0 to P1 and subsequently to P2, resulting in inflation. Here output falls as price level increases, causes unemployment to rise. The combination of inflation and rising unemployment is called stagflation, which spells bad news for the economy. Let us now focus on cost of inflation with the help of the following video.
Costs of inflation. Inflation increases the nominal interest rate in the long run due to the Fisher effect, causing an increase in the opportunity cost of holding money. People prefer to hold their money in saving accounts rather than cash in hand, which means they have to make a trip to the bank each time they want to withdraw cash. The cost of each trip involves the cost of transportation or the time spent traveling or waiting in the queue. Such costs are usually very nominal and are called shoe leather cost. When inflation is highly variable, people suffer from money illusion, which implies that they cannot make a clear distinction between nominal and real variables. Those who are saving or investing find it difficult to compute the real and the nominal interest rate. Salaried persons especially cannot easily calculate the changes in their real income if inflation is highly volatile and unpredictable. These difficulties severely affect economic decision making. Inflation reduces the purchasing power of money, thereby increasing the cost of living. Workers are paid in nominal terms. When inflation arises, they suffer from a fall in their real wages, which lowers their standard of living. When inflation is high and volatile, assets whose returns are fixed in nominal terms become very risky to hold, as it becomes difficult to ascertain their real value. Pensioners also suffer when they find that inflation has eroded their income, which was fixed in nominal terms. If inflation is high and debt is issued in nominal terms, then debtors will be better off than creditors, as the real debt would have fallen. In countries where inflation is very high and variable, contracts set in nominal terms are unacceptable. For instance, nobody would like to make a loan fearing a fall in the real value of the returns. Thus, to avoid distortion, all contracts, including wage and debt contracts, must be fully indexed to inflation. This, however, is very difficult to implement in practice. Inflation also causes tax distortions. Capital gains tax is calculated on the difference between the sale price of an asset and its purchase price. If the sale price of the asset rises due to inflation and the purchase price is not indexed to inflation, then capital gain, which is the difference between the sale price and the purchase price of the asset, would be some positive amount, even though there was no real gain in the value of the asset. A capital gains tax would be, in a sense, penalize the asset holder for no fault of his. Let us understand this better with an example. Suppose Mr. X purchases a house for rupees 10 lakhs. Assume yearly inflation rate is 10%. A year later, if he wants to sell the house, it would sell at price of rupees 10 into 1 lakhs, and he would make a capital gain which is equal to the difference between 10 plus 1 lakhs and rupees 10 lakhs, which means sale price minus purchase price. A tax on the capital gain would be distortionary, as he did not get any real gain from the sale of the asset. Ideally, the purchase price should have been indexed to inflation so that it would be rupees 10 plus 1 lakhs, which would make the net gain equal to 0, and therefore capital gains tax would not be imposed. When nominal income of workers increases due to inflation, they move into higher tax brackets where the rate of taxation may be higher. This is called bracket creep, which is again distortionary. Some people do not gain from a rise in real income, yet they have to bear a higher tax liability.
We will now learn how inflation can influence an important macroeconomic phenomena, that is the unemployment rate. Unemployment may be related. As the unemployment rate falls, the labor market becomes tight, workers' bargaining position improves, and they ask for higher wages. Higher wages raise the cost of production and hence prices that are set by firms as a markup over cost. Higher prices reduce real wages, inducing workers to ask for another round of hike in wages. That in turn fuels further rise in prices. This analysis implies that there exists an inverse relation between unemployment and inflation. But is there always such a trade-off between inflation and unemployment? Can policymakers actually choose a lower unemployment rate by allowing the inflation rate to rise? Our discussion below and in the next module throws light on these issues. Let the rate of wage inflation be written as GW. GW is equal to W1 minus W0 over W0, where W1 is the wage in the current period and W0 is the wage in the preceding period. Then the equation for the Phillips curve could be written as GW is equal to alpha minus beta mu, where mu is the unemployment rate and beta measures the responsiveness of wage increases to unemployment. The negative sign shows the inverse relationship. As unemployment increases, the rate of wage inflation falls as workers have less bargaining power. Conversely, if unemployment falls, the rate of wage inflation rises. In 1960, Paul Samuelson and Robert Solow further expanded the thesis by spelling out the relation between wages and prices and substituting wage inflation with price inflation. They studied the relationship between rate of inflation and the unemployment rate for the United States over the period 1934 to 1958, comparing the year-over-year increases in the average price level with the average annual unemployment rate. Thus, the Phillips curve came to be described as a relationship between rate of increase in prices and the rate of unemployment. The inverse relationship between the two was reaffirmed. Let us illustrate this. Let n is equal to P1 minus P0 over P0, where P is the price level in the current period and P0 is the price level in the preceding period and n is the rate of inflation. We can put this in place of GW, S in the original Phillips curve equation to get the modern version, which is phi is equal to alpha minus beta mu. The term alpha captures the effects of parameters such as markup rate, unemployment benefits, price expectations, etc. that can cause the downward sloping Phillips curve to shift, figure 3 below, while the value of beta measures the responsiveness of inflation to unemployment. The equation establishes an inverse relationship between the rate of unemployment and the rate of inflation. If one falls, the other rises, and vice versa. Let us understand with the help of the following diagram. Suppose unemployment is low at mu, workers will demand a high nominal wage as they have more bargaining power. Firms increase the price level in response to an increase in nominal wage. Thus, low unemployment causes inflation to rise. The Phillips curve. Suppose the economy is at UN where inflation is zero and the government decides to increase aggregate demand by through fiscal or monetary expansion. At the initial level of output, this additional demand causes inflation to rise from 0 to 0.0%. As the real wage falls, firms are encouraged to produce more. The rate of unemployment falls to U and the economic moves to B. Thus, high inflation is the cost of low unemployment. The trade-off would hold if money wages do not rise as fast as prices or wage revision is gradually done so that real wage stays below the original level, allowing firms to employ more labor. This is possible only in the short run So the trade-off depicted here is called the short-run Phillips curve. The trade-off can be sustained so long as real wages can be kept low by fooling the workers. In fact, Friedman had questioned the sustainability of the trade-off since workers cannot be systematically fooled. Now we will look at the implications and arguments associated with Phillips curve. The data of the United States was studied over the period from 1948 to 1960, depicting the inverse relationship. The time period in which their study was conducted, inflation rate was on an average close to zero, as it was positive in some years and negative in others. The expected inflation was zero, and the simple relationship between inflation and unemployment was very evident. The downward sloping curve seemed to represent a stable relation which the policymaker could use to choose different combinations of inflation and unemployment. The Phillips curve relation held a lot of influence in academic and policy circles till the end of 1960s. However, the simple relationship between inflation and unemployment disappeared in the 1970s. Two factors were important in explaining this development. First, the oil price shock of 1973 and 79 and high and persistent inflation. Let us look at them in detail. The oil price shock of 1973 and 79 led to an increase in non-labor cost or the markup that induces firm to increase the price of the goods that they were producing. This resulted in an increase in inflation even though the rate of unemployment remained unchanged. During this time, inflation was high and persistent, and people started incorporating this in their formation of expectation. So, instead of believing that price level would be the same as last year or zero inflation, when inflation was high and persistent, they started forming some expectation about inflation. This also led to an increase in inflation at any given rate of unemployment. That is, the Phillips curve was no longer static. It had shifted upwards as inflationary expectations turned positive. So, the Phillips curve essentially represented a stable trade-off only in the short run when price expectations remained unchanged. Thus, two missing links, the markup rate and the role of expected inflation, caused the breakdown of the short-run Phillips curve. In due course, both the missing links were introduced by augmenting the Phillips curve, which we study in the next unit. Now we look at inflation in India. There are two measures of inflation, namely WPI, which is Wholesale Price Index, and CPI, that is Consumer Price Index. In India, inflation is calculated using WPI instead of CPI, as it is the only index that is available on a weekly basis. Of the two, CPI is used by other countries as it is an appropriate measure for a number of reasons. First, CPI uses the actual prices that consumers pay which gives a better estimate of the cost of living, whereas WPI uses wholesale prices, which does not fully reflect the impact of inflation on consumers. Second, most of the items included in WPI are not relevant for the consumers as these are not consumed by them. Finally, services are not included in WPI, which makes it an inadequate measure given the growing importance of services for the consumers. The reason for not including services could be due to lack of reliable data on prices of services and the non-tradability of some services. Given the drawbacks of WPI, experts recommended the shift to a more useful CPI-based measure. In fact, in April 2014, the RBI announced the implementation of some of the recommendations of Urjit Patel Committee report, including adoption of the new CPI combined as the key measure of inflation. The headline inflation, that is, year on year for any month in a given year, for example, January 2013, is calculated as the percentage change in the value of WPI in January 2013 over its value in January 2012. In India, the headline inflation was 9.56% in 2010-11 and 8.94% in 11-12 according to the Economic Survey 2013-14. The survey reports that inflation in India stems from a traditional imbalance between demand and supply. Food inflation is the major driver. There has been a considerable shift towards protein-rich food such as meat and fish in the consumption basket, but the supply of these items has not kept pace with the demand. Also, a change in control prices, as with diesel, can lead to inflation. Inflation has been a major cause of concern for both the government and the RBI. They have taken a number of measures to contain it. Reducing demand through higher interest rates or fiscal consolidation, improving supply by giving appropriate incentives to suppliers, protecting vulnerable consumers through targeted subsidy. Since inflation is caused by a mismatch between demand and supply, proper demand and supply management policies can be framed by curbing demand moderately in the short run so as to allow supply to catch up with the demand. Whereas in the long run, measures to increase supply would have to be the primary solution, as curbing demand would be unwise and difficult.
Let us summarize what we have learned in this module. Inflation is caused by either demand pull or cost push factors. Along with the increase in inflation, the former increases output whereas the latter reduces output. Inflation reduces the purchasing power of money, distorts taxes, affects contracts fixed in nominal terms, and makes it difficult to compute real variables. The short-term Phillips curve shows an inverse relationship between rate of inflation and rate of unemployment. In India, inflation is measured by year on year change in wholesale price index. But lately, the RBI has announced the adoption of consumer price index as a measure of inflation. As elsewhere, inflation is caused by an imbalance between demand and supply factors. In the fight against inflation, demand management may help in the short run, but long run solution needs improvements on the supply side, that of food in particular.